Hello, and welcome to the Advancing Pilot Podcast, the show for the aspiring commercial pilot or anyone interested in learning more, increasing your skills, and flying more safely. Thank you for tuning in to episode 3 of the show. Last week, we talked about tips for flying at night, and I shared some thoughts on the commercial night cross-country versus the private pilot night cross-country, so be sure to check out episode 2 if you missed it. This episode is all about the life cycle of pilot proficiency, ways the proficiency rises and falls both in the short term and over longer periods of time, and how we can leverage this knowledge as pilots. I'm also going to try out something brand new this week that I'm calling Tales from the PHAC. The PHAC, of course, is the Pilot's Handbook of Aeronautical Knowledge, which is a great information source that we can all benefit from, but it's not always convenient to pick up a copy and read from it. So I'm going to bring a few minutes of the PHAC to your morning commute or time at the gym or whatever you like to do while you listen. Let me know what you think of this new segment. This podcast is here to help fill in some of the many knowledge gaps that exist between the mandatory required training to earn certificates and the ability to fly competently and confidently. We'll discuss items like how to make your night flights or long cross-country safer and more comfortable, make your flight training more efficient, keep your passengers more comfortable, and improve your proficiency across the broad variety of skills that are necessary for being a safe and capable pilot. My name is Jeff. I'm an instrument-rated commercial pilot, advanced ground instructor, and instrument ground instructor, also in the home stretch of finishing up my CFI certificate as I record this in early 2026. If you enjoy this content, make sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. I also hope that you will sign up for my free email newsletter at advancingpilot.com, and you may also want to check out my Instagram, where I am Advancing Pilot. Before we jump in, I just want to remind you that these ideas are not a substitute for training with your CFI, so use them as a starting point for discussion with your instructor before attempting anything discussed here. This week, I've been thinking a lot about proficiency and how it changes over months and years and even decades, as well as how it could rise and then fall off within the course of a single day, and what we could do about this as pilots. Consider a brand new student pilot on their first discovery flight. They are full of enthusiasm, but have very little capability to operate the aircraft safely without near constant attention from their instructor. As they progress through their training, they acquire knowledge through repeated exposure to information and various scenarios, both in flight and on the ground, and they acquire skills through repeated practice. Even if they study every day as their knowledge test or check ride approaches, they are still constantly forgetting little bits of information that they learned weeks or months ago, kind of like trying to fill a bucket with water that has small holes in the bottom of the bucket. While this sounds like a doomed arrangement, it actually works out fine most of the time because the student is taking those rote-learned facts and not only remembering many of them, but also incorporating them into knowledge and wisdom, which can outlive the short-term memory of the details. They might have forgotten what a code of 9900 indicates on a winds aloft forecast, but before forgetting it, their brain used that fact to develop an understanding of how the related forecasting tool works and where to quickly reference those obscure codes if they're needed. Similarly, the ability to perform challenging skills will increase as we use or practice them and then slowly degrade over time with disuse. A student pilot with 50 hours of experience may be able to confidently and skillfully demonstrate a power-on stall for their check ride, but 10 years and 1,000 or so flight hours later, they might panic at the very thought of this maneuver if they haven't practiced it much over the years. Proficiency can also change drastically on a shorter cycle over the course of a day. Let's revisit that pilot who is rusty at performing power-on stalls. Let's say that they wisely decide to grab an instructor to get back up to speed on the maneuver. When this rusty pilot starts the lesson, they are full of energy but maybe out of practice on their technique. After 40 minutes or so of practice with the instructor, maybe they're at a performance peak, simultaneously being back up to speed on the maneuver while also having a reasonable amount of physical and mental energy reserves remaining. If the lesson continues for another hour or two of endlessly practicing power-on stalls, performance will begin to drop off as physical and mental fatigue sets in. Now that we understand how the ability to proficiently perform a task changes over both short and long periods of time, let's talk about a few ways that we can use this knowledge as pilots. Number 1, the pre-flight proficiency check. Before any flight, consider which skills you may have lost proficiency with from lack of practice. Maybe you've been flying a ton all summer and your stick and rudder flying skills are the sharpest that they've ever been, but your instrument flying may have been neglected and may have deteriorated to a point that you're still legally current but not as proficient as you should be. It's a dangerous assumption that your instrument skills will still be there if you need them to handle degrading weather conditions when you haven't practiced them in months. Before any instrument flight or marginal VFR flight that might turn into IFR, I like to ask myself, could I competently and confidently handle this IFR flight if the autopilot died on me in IMC? Could I perform any unpublished holds or less than common instructions that ATC might give me on this flight? If the answer is no, then it's time to think about training myself back up to that level. Number 2, leverage the warm-up. Don't attempt a flight that may require proficiency in a task when you're rusty at core skills for that task. Consider a pilot who has not flown in 2 months and is planning a flight from their home field, which has a 7,000-foot nice wide runway, to a small airport with a short and skinny runway. While it may be tempting to just take off and fly directly to that tiny destination airstrip, why not do a few touch and goes in the pattern at your comfortably sized home base airport in order to refresh both the motor skills of landing the plane, as well as the memory items such as proper procedures, aircraft configuration, and best airspeeds for a short field takeoff and landing. By taking a few practice laps first, the pilot is compensating for the long-term drop in proficiency that occurred over those months of inactivity by leveraging the short-term increase in proficiency that occurs with getting fresh practice in the same task on the same day. Number 3, be mindful of task saturation. Think about foundational proficiencies that are required for your more challenging skills. If you haven't flown in several months and your instrument currency has expired during that time, consider knocking the rust off of your fundamental flying skills before attempting to regain instrument proficiency. If your brain is task saturated just trying to keep up with the basic operation of the aircraft, then the added task load of instrument flying is likely to prevent success from occurring with either. Number 4, perform a fatigue and human factors check. Consider fatigue and other human factors. As pilots, many of us like to think of ourselves as tireless and always mission capable. However, it is important to realize that our ability to complete a task deteriorates with fatigue and other forms of discomfort. Flying a successful instrument approach when you're fresh is a much different experience than flying your third approach of the day in the dark after a long day of flying when you're hungry and you've had a lousy night's sleep in the hotel the night before and maybe you need to go to the bathroom. Personally, my favorite way to address this risk is to manage expectations of passengers or anyone else who assume that a flight will proceed as planned no matter what external factors arise. Inviting another pilot to join you on a long or challenging trip is another great way to potentially reduce fatigue and provide an extra layer of safety. The airlines improve safety by relying on multiple pilots in the cockpit and limiting the number of hours per day that any pilot could be on duty. General aviation pilots operating under Part 91 don't generally have these limitations unless you're flying for an organization such as Civil Air Patrol or a few other specific scenarios, but we can still choose to adopt these practices to improve the operational safety of our own missions. Number 5, take a break instead of overtraining. Don't reinforce poor performance by overtraining it. We've all had training days when it just isn't going well. Recall being a student pilot trying to master your landing flare or crosswind landings, or maybe your check ride was coming up and those steep turns that you've been executing flawlessly are suddenly dumping 150 feet of altitude in the first 90 degrees of your turn. Sometimes you could stick it out, figure out what you're doing wrong, and regain your proficiency and confidence. Other days you keep grinding away and the results just aren't getting any better. One more and I'll get it, you tell yourself, but they just keep staying the same or even getting worse. At that point, there are at least 2 good reasons to call it a day instead of continuing to endlessly grind it out. First, continuing to work at a task without seeing any improvement is emotionally draining and can begin to sap your enthusiasm and joy for flying. Second, practice doesn't make perfect. It just reinforces whatever you're practicing. Let's say you bounce a landing because your airspeed on approach and touchdown is way too fast, and you decide to stay in the pattern and keep practicing landings until you get it right. Maybe you'll recognize and correct that error during your next lap or 2 around the pattern, but if you keep flying endless touch and goes without recognizing the problem, you're just reinforcing the habit of flying your approaches with excessive airspeed and probably abusing the heck out of your poor airplane. It's better to stop, call it a day, and maybe go up with an instructor next time who can help you figure out what is going wrong and give you some tips to fix it. We tend to think of our ratings and certificates in the hundreds or thousands of hours in our logbooks as proof that we're safe and capable pilots. In reality, Accident statistics show that our piloting skills are a highly perishable commodity, and the fact that we're able to fly confident short-field landings or 3 near-perfect instrument approaches on a check ride many years ago does not necessarily reflect our current capabilities. The same thinking can be applied to nearly any aspect of our flying abilities, from pre-flight inspection to fuel management. In addition to long-term variations in currency and proficiency, we need awareness of changes that occur throughout the day as well. To assess ourselves honestly, we need to consider not only our past qualifications, but our status as the pilot currently operating the aircraft on this day and at this moment. Up next is Tales from the PHAC. Today's Tales of the PHAC will be reading from Chapter 2, page 24 if you're reading along, of the Pilot's Handbook of Aeronautical Knowledge. Since maintaining situational awareness ties in nicely with our topic of proficiency, that's the section that I'll be reading from today. Okay. Here we go with Tales from the PHAC. Situational awareness is the accurate perception and understanding of all the factors and conditions within the 5 fundamental risk elements of pilot, flight, aircraft, environment, and type of operation that comprise any given aviation situation that affect safety before, during, and after the flight. Monitoring radio communications for traffic, weather discussion, and ATC communication can enhance situational awareness by helping the pilot develop a mental picture of what is happening. Maintaining situational awareness requires an understanding of the relative significance of all flight-related factors and their future impact on the flight. When a pilot understands what is going on and has an overview of the total operation, he or she is not fixated on one perceived significant factor. Not only is it important for a pilot to know the aircraft's geographical location, but it is important that he or she understand what is happening. For instance, when flying above Richmond, Virginia toward Dulles Airport or Leesburg, the pilot should know why he or she is being vectored and be able to anticipate spatial location. A pilot who is simply making turns without understanding why has added an additional burden to his or her management in the event of an emergency. To maintain situational awareness, all of the skills involved in ADM are used. Obstacles to maintaining situational awareness. Fatigue, stress, and work overload can cause a pilot to fixate on a single perceived important item and reduce an overall situational awareness of the flight. A contributing factor in many accidents is a distraction that diverts the pilot's attention from monitoring the instruments or scanning outside the aircraft. Many flight deck distractions begin as a minor problem, such as a gauge that is not reading correctly, but result in accidents as the pilot diverts attention to the perceived problem and neglects proper control of the aircraft. Workload management. Effective workload management ensures essential operations are accomplished by planning, prioritizing, and sequencing tasks to avoid work overload. As experience is gained, a pilot learns to recognize future workload requirements and can prepare for high workload periods during times of low workload. Reviewing the appropriate chart and setting radio frequencies well in advance of when they are needed helps reduce workload as the flight nears the airport. In addition, a pilot should listen to ATIS, ASOS, or AWOS if available, and then monitor the tower frequency or CTAF to get a good idea of what traffic conditions to expect. Checklists should be performed well in advance so there's time to focus on traffic and ATC instructions. These procedures are especially important prior to entering a high-density traffic area such as Class B airspace. Recognizing a work overload situation is also an important component of managing workload. The first effect of high workload is that the pilot may be working harder but accomplishing less. As workload increases, attention cannot be devoted to several tasks at a time, and the pilot may begin to focus on one item. When a pilot becomes task-saturated, there is no awareness of input from various sources, so decisions may be made on incomplete information and the possibility of error increases. When a work overload situation exists, a pilot needs to stop, think, slow down, and prioritize. Well, that's all for today. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of the Advancing Pilot Podcast. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next episode and sign up for my email newsletter at advancingpilot.com. Thanks for listening and fly safe.